Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the final session of the Prakash Gole Memorial Series for 2021. This series has been co-organized by Ecological Society Pune and ATREE Bangalore. The title for today's session is Translating Understanding into Action for Sustainability. My name is Sharad Lele and I'm with ATREE, and my co-host for today's session is Gurudas from the Ecological Society. As you know, over the past 4 months, Ecological Society Pune and ATREE have organized 4 webinars in this series. The overall title for the series was Understanding Reality, and we chose different topics or different aspects of what pertains to a sustainable and equitable society: the economy, water, food, and cities. Of course, this is just scratching the surface in some sense. We could have had more sessions, more themes. Each of these themes deserves probably 5 sessions each or more. But we made a small beginning in terms of unpacking some of the complexities as to what it would require to, how we would even think about a sustainable and equitable economy or sustainable and equitable use of water, and so on. We're ending the series focusing on the question of how we might translate understanding into action. I think all of us in this room are already making some efforts, however small they might be, in terms of contributing towards change, towards making our society more sustainable and just. But we have often wondered whether what we are doing is enough or not, what we are doing is in the right direction, or we need to actually change direction, we need to do something differently. And in fact, after the last 4 webinars, we might be even more concerned that the magnitude of the problems that we are facing is so vast, so complicated, that really, is there anything we can do at all? So we don't want to end the series on a sort of a situation where we feel completely paralyzed by the analysis that we have done so far. And we thought we'd focus on the question of how we translate understanding into action. For this session, we have 6 panelists that we have drawn from the past sessions. And so I want to first of all thank all of them for rejoining us for this final session. And we have some really, we have had a set of very outstanding speakers in the last 4 sessions, from which we have requested Kalpanatai Salunkhe, who is trustee of Gram Gaurav Pratishthan; Shripad Dharmadhikari, who is founder coordinator of Manthan, Adhyayan, Kendra; Professor Amita Baviskar, who is a professor at Ashoka University; Girish Sohoni, who is president BAIF; Ashish Kothari, who is one of the founders of Kalpavriksh; and Professor Rajeswari Raina, who is a professor at Shiv University. So thank you all of you for accepting our invitation to rejoin for this final session and to share some of your thoughts. As I mentioned, that we all try to do certain things in order to translate our concerns into action. What we'd like you to do, and I'm going to request the panelists to share their individual experiences, is keeping this idea of action based on understanding in front of us, and say, what has been your experience in terms of translating understanding into action in the sectors that you have worked in the sectors that you are familiar with, drawing upon your own work of the others. The idea is that we all know that individual action, for example, changing our consumption habits or improving the recycling of our waste, is one level of action that we can all take. And at the same time, we all see that whatever actions we are taking are simply not adding up to making the society sort of move in the direction of sustainable, being a sustainable society, being a just society, a society where there's dignity for all today, there is dignity, likely to be dignity for future generations, including non-human beings. So in that context, what are the other levels of action that one can be engaged with? People are engaged with them. So what are those levels of action? Which approaches work? Which approaches don't work? What is the role for advocacy or sangharsh versus nirman or implementation? These are some of the questions that we'd like you to reflect on. And I'm going to request each of the speakers to start with maybe 5 to 7 minutes of reflection on this question of, in your opinion, with your experience, what kind of action based on understanding has worked, what hasn't worked, what are some of the challenges? And we'll do one round of these your impressions, and then Gurudas and I will chip in with maybe some pointed questions based upon what you have said. We'll do one more round of responses before opening up. Hopefully, at about halfway stage, we will open it up to the audience and take questions from the audience. One last sort of request to the audience: please keep your microphones muted if they are not muted by the software already. And while the chat window is open for you to chat, we request you to post your questions in the Q&A box. That will make it easier for us to track the questions rather than have to go through all the chats. So with that, let me begin by requesting Kalpanatai to begin by sharing her experience. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My experience has been in the drought-prone area and in the sector of water. As everybody knows, Vilasrao Salunkhe, my husband, he started the Pani Panchayat movement in Purandar block. And 72 to now 2021, a lot of changes has taken place. But everybody has recognized the importance of irrigation and protective irrigation for the crops. And especially with the climate change, this factor is very important. I think this introductory 5 sentences enough. Shripad?
No, it's not 5 sentences, Kalpanatai, 5 to 7 minutes.
It's 5 to 7 minutes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry if I miscommunicated.
Okay.
So please go ahead and share your experience.
Yes, actually we started in 72 drought. Initially it was a kind of relief work. But then when we started working in that area, the first question was why we can not concentrate on conserving the water rather than giving some relief or dushkari kamo for the sufferers. Then I think 74 to 78, we were in Naigaon, wherein we worked with the villagers on the watershed development. And when we were in 74 in Naigaon village, in spite of the good rain, there were floods and as well as there were long dry spells. So the importance of protective irrigation for the crops, especially the Kharif and Rabi crop, was emphasized on. And then the total water budget for the village Naigaon was worked out. And while talking with the farmers, how we can implement this, then the people came forward and said that 20% of the cost we can bear for the lifting the water conservation should be done through the government. And when we worked out the water balance for the village Naigaon, there was enough water for half an acre, that is 1,000 cube meter per capita was available. And the people accepted that as per the number of people in the family, we will do the community lift irrigation scheme. The water conservation works were already done in village Naigaon. And so small groups of farmers came together and they started community lift irrigation scheme. Of course, since 74 to 2021, lot of changes have taken place, especially the extraction of water and maximum use of water has led towards the dark zones in the drought-prone area. So sustainable, equitable and productive use of water is a challenge. And for that, I think it is a long way to go, but still the things are changing.
Thank you. Shripad?
Yes. So, good evening, everybody, and thank you, everybody, for joining in here and giving us this opportunity to share some of our thoughts. Let me try and respond to some of the questions which Sharad has posed in terms of how do we look at translating our understanding into action, our understanding about sustainability. And before that, let me just say a few brief words that my experience centers mainly around my work, and my experience centers mainly around work around water, rivers, dams. For a long time, I was a part of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which is a movement which is fighting the dams on the Narmada River. Subsequently, I have been also working on larger water policy issues. We've been looking at water privatization and commodification, in the water sector, transformation of the water sector into a market. We have also been looking at impacts of coal on water. And of course, so coal mining, coal burning, power generation, and what impact that has on water. And of course, looking at rivers and dams and irrigation, hydropower. So with this background, I would like to share my understanding of transforming some of the key issues regarding transforming understanding into action. So first of all, I think that this is an iterative process. In the sense, we develop some understanding, we try to take some action based on it, and that action leads to further understanding. So I think it's not a, like we develop our understanding and then go to action, but it's a continuous process of understanding through action and action through understanding. I think that is one of the lessons which I have learned over the past several decades of my work. Second thing is, we always keep talking about, what is the correct or better way, individual choices, changes in individual lifestyle, or systemic change, whether a sangharsh, whether we need to fight, whether activism is important, or whether nirman, constructive work, we go and build something, maybe check dams or maybe something. I think this is a false dichotomy. I think we need each and every aspect, each and every element of this. I think that is really what I would also like to say. So just to give some very brief examples from my experience. So first of all, we need action. When we look at action, I think we need action both at the macro level and the micro level. To give you an example from our work, when we have been looking at the impact of coal mining and coal power plants on water, there is huge pollution from these activities. Okay, so we don't need to, and we have been working on how to have better policies, better laws, and better regulations. What should be the kind of monitoring apparatus to monitor this pollution and control it? But that work at the macro level cannot happen unless there is a concurrent micro level work, which is, for example, trying to look at the pollution from some specific individual power plants. So for example, we have been studying some of the power plants around Akpur at Khaparkheda and Kothari, and seeing how they are how they are polluting the water resources. And then what that helps us, what that tells us in terms of what should be the kind of regulations that should be there, what should be the monitoring apparatus. And that feeds into the policy. So I think one lesson that I would like to say is that whatever action is there, it has to be at the macro and micro level. And again, there has to be a give and take between that. Second thing is, so like I am talking about water sector, but no sector or no resource exists in isolation. So whatever we think about in terms of action, it has to be intersectoral. To give you a quick example, one of the big issues that we took up when we have been challenging the Narmada Dam, that is that we are saying that rivers must flow. And we cannot extract all the water from a river. It's the basic character of a river to keep flowing, right? So rivers must keep flowing. And there is a whole argument which is of the establishment, which says that, if we don't use like almost every drop of water from the river, we are not going to be able to irrigate our fields, and we don't have enough water to produce enough food for our entire country. So, in fact, one of the irrigation engineers said that the water can either flow in the rivers or it can flow in our fields. Now, if we want to challenge this, and we found that we could challenge it, but to do this, we not only have to look at rivers and water and dam building, but we have to look at the crops, the kind of water intensive crops that we are growing, whether and in areas which are for which those crops are not suited. So we are growing rice in Punjab, which is a arid or semi-arid area, and so many other examples can be given. So unless we look at the cropping pattern, we cannot look at how to conserve rivers and how to keep the rivers flowing, and therefore how to conserve the ecology of the river. So I would say that we need the intersectoral approach. And again, I think we need the systemic change to happen, and we also need individual choices. Just to come back to this issue of cropping, change in cropping pattern. Suppose we say that we don't want to grow so much rice, and we grow less water intensive crops like say bajri or jowar or other crops. Then so that's a systemic change. But then that cannot happen unless we change our individual food habits. So again, this has to go together. And similarly, Sangharsh and Nirman, because anytime you want to make any change, then there is going to be some resistance to that change. So there will be an element of Sangharsh or of struggle or a fight. It can be at a very low level, it can be at a very intense level. That would depend on the situation, but it goes hand in hand. You try to make some change through an action like a Nirman, work of Nirman, and you try to change the you need to also fight the resistance to change. So again, it goes together. And lastly, I will close with my last point, that whatever we do in terms of action, and of course all these elements of that action, ultimately I think our actions have to add up to reducing our consumption. And not just consumption of water or forest or wood or this thing. It's unless all our actions add up in some or the other way to reduce our consumption of matter and energy in all forms, we cannot talk about sustainability. So that should be the larger goal of all our actions. And most important point, reduction in consumption cannot happen without equity, because unless there is equity, mere reduction in consumption will in fact accentuate or aggravate the problems of those who are the have-nots. So equity becomes a very, very important point of any of our actions. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shripad. I'd like to invite the next speaker. I think it's Amita in my list.
Thanks, Sharad. I'm mainly going to talk about cities and urban bodies. And of course, a lot of people ask, where is the environment in cities and what does sustainability mean? So I just want to begin by saying that the idea of ecology is actually a metaphor for all kinds of coexistence. And by that, I mean that we think of cities not just in terms of the interdependencies between different kinds of people, living beings, the built environment, and the entire biophysical world and its processes on which we depend, but that we also think about cultural diversity, about pluralism, about tolerance, about the idea of civility, of how we behave towards each other as citizens of a republic. And this means that the metaphor of ecology is something that we should apply not only when talking about natural elements like land or water or air, but we should also apply it to places that we have created. For instance, the city street. It should be something that includes not only trees and tarred roads, not only dogs and cows and crows, but it should also include, if you think of shops, also mobile street vendors. We should think of cyclists and public transport and private vehicles all together, because this idea of being able to accommodate diversity in the city is in fact the promise of cities everywhere. And in a democratic country, that becomes all the more imperative. So having said that, I think it's important to note why we're not able to achieve either sustainability or social justice in cities. And I think the chief problem there is that resources that should be held in common have actually been captured by elites. And wherever you look at the use of common resources, space, for instance, could it be space for housing, or it could be space for something like a playground? We find that there's huge inequality in people's access to land for living on, land to work with, and so on. And this is where we find that the question of social justice is always squeezed out. So people are forced to make informal arrangements for which they then get penalized. So a basti is treated as an encroachment, and people who live there get criminalized. Now, within this, we also find that people who make up the majority of the city, whose labor keeps the city running, are in fact also squeezed out of processes of decision making. Urban planning has no way of actually taking on board the desires, the aspirations, as well as the day-to-day predicament of most working class people. What then precipitates change? One, very often, it's a crisis. Think, for instance, of the Surat plague of 1994, which highlighted the way in which there was a crisis around solid waste management, and a crisis that affected everybody. It was a binding crisis, which meant that then the government went into action, tried to do something by way of cleaning up the city, and so on. Now, these kinds of problems, which are common problems that affect all citizens, happen all the time with environmental issues in cities. Take air pollution, for instance. But what happens today, because of the huge inequality in our cities, is the fact that you have elite escape. Rich people have air purifiers in their homes. They live in air conditioned spaces. They drive in air conditioned cars. They go to air conditioned offices, shopping malls, multiplexes, what have you. Now, what that means is that the point that everybody should come together and fight for an issue, in fact, tends to get weakened in such circumstances. It also means that often elites come up with solutions that end up making life much worse for poorer people. I don't have time to go into instances of this, so I'll leave it at that. But since crisis often precipitates action that misfires from the point of view of ecological sustainability as well as social justice, what then should we do? I think the success stories we see are based on different kinds of people coming together, environmentalists as well as organizations of people from below. Take, for instance, the way in which in both Delhi as well as in Pune, waste recyclers of different kinds have come together and have worked with environmentalist supporters in order to make new claims, both in terms of how they add a positive benefit to the environment by dealing with our waste stream, by making sure that new production is reduced because we're recycling. They're now able to use new arguments as well about, for instance, the value of recycling in the context of global warming. So I think there's a way in which we need new kinds of coalitions that are sensitive to the issue of social justice as well as the issue of sustainability. And this is the kind of coalition politics that can lead first to the recognition of poor people's rights as well as their lower ecological footprint as well as their positive contribution to the urban environment, and from that recognition to representation. And I think also of the work of transport activists who have challenged giant infrastructural projects in cities like flyovers in Bangalore, in Pune, in Delhi, and who have then tried to make connections with, say, people who cycle, either upper class residents who cycle for leisure or those who cycle because that is the cheapest commute that they can afford. So I think that the way forward lies not in, first of all, appealing to the courts, because we've seen that courts often give drastic actions which end up creating more misery than actually solving anything. I think we have to go carefully, slowly, and really pay attention to the difficult work of trying to mobilize in ways where a lot of different points of view and perspectives get accommodated. I think the role of the state is terrifically important, but states only act when there's pressure on them to do so. And the kind of pressure that's needed to implement laws, for instance, around composting in Bangalore, or laws about water harvesting in Tamil Nadu, these are great initiatives, but they're only as good as the work on the ground. And for that, one just has to do that slow, steady, tedious work of bringing people together and doing practical solutions on the ground.
Thanks a lot, Amita. Over to you, Girish.
Yeah, thank you, Sharad. And it was quite stimulating to listen to Shripad and Amita and Kalpanatai. I would like to share a different dimension of this linkage between understanding and action. I think the connect between understanding and action is very strongly through the choice of values. And what is our choice of values and what is our clarity about the values involved really makes a lot of influence on what are the actions that are going to ensue. And then one can define as core values and there can be other derived values. Like if you are talking of understanding that we have developed through all these different thematic webinars we had in the past, would we look at values like frugality? Would we look at conservation as a value? Would we look at harmony as a value? If we look at these, then probably they are the core, and the understanding of these probably helps to influence our thinking of what action should be. What are the choice of actions? What are the actions that can be taken? If you are talking of frugality, then the frugality means less consumption, as Shripad was saying. Frugality means no wastage, as was mentioned. Now, if you are talking of that, then these derived things out of the core value of frugality implies that there are certain choices of action we are talking of. We are talking of circularity of the economy. We are talking of recycling. We are talking of ways by which we will have actions which will choices we make in development action which will make sure that there is no wastage. So these are the choice. Once we have frugality as an identified core value, there are many implications that it leads to. But take the case of conservation. If we have conservation as a value, then diversity is a derived value, and therefore something which upholds diversity becomes an important choice of action. Or if we take harmony, if that is a core value, then the harmony means that we are not, it's different levels of harmony. We are talking of, if we have a clarity on what we mean by harmony, we will know more and more deeper elements of that. So is it harmony among people? Is it harmony between the human being and the natural resources? Is it harmony between the ecology as a whole? So all that probably means different sets of actions. So there is some sort of a understanding of lack of alienation when we talk of harmony. And if we are talking of lack of alienation, it also has implications on actions relating to education. So you need education which is non-alienating. We need education which is increasing the harmony with the surroundings. So I think the pathway to action goes through the choice of values. And the understanding should help us to define values better, to have develop a better clarity on values. And that is something which will lead us to better action and diverse types of actions. It is also another aspect when we decide, when we have a choice of values that we have chosen, that also helps us to position properly in terms of the time factor. What is the pace of change? And that will also define actions. What is the resource intensity of change? That will also help us to define action. Like, for example, if we say, okay, the 40-year-old green revolution achieved something and achieved something which probably in hindsight we consider as problematic. But then we are seeing that there was a sense of rapid pace requirement in those choice of actions. And therefore, if we are looking at the basic core values, if we accept those as the important drivers like conservation, like frugality, like harmony, then probably you won't make the choices of a rapid pace of development. And that means that one will have a space for slow science, one will have a space for slow research, one will have a space for slow development. And therefore, the time value of money will be very different depending on your choice of values. And the time value of money is different, then the economics changes drastically. In fact, economics becomes subservient to ecology if the time value of money is very low. So, there are different, the choice of values affects substantially your choice of development actions. This is one important thing we have to understand. And then it will apply to whether it is urban areas development, it is about, sustainability aspects, it is about, issues of intersectoral aspects, which like Shripad mentioned. So all these things are very important. But if our values are properly defined, then there are certain choices we make, and then that will happen. And I would also like to introduce, before I end, a very brilliant concept which was put forth by Wendell Berry uh, 40 years back. So we are probably not given enough attention to that. And that concept is called solving for pattern. So he's talking of how, if there is a problem to be solved and we are solving that particular problem, we have a limited effect, limited positive effect, probably you understand the pattern problem, and that larger problem is nested into a still larger problem. And when we are solving a problem, if we are also not creating that other problem more acute, which is the larger problem, if you are also solving that problem, if you're solving the problem which is nested beyond that, then probably we are developing a solution which is a pattern. And that solution for a pattern will make a lot of difference, because it will not make, a solution become a problem. And so if we have that type of approach, for example, the end result of any solution is going to lead to better health. And it is not just human health. We are talking of human health combined with animal health, combined with the health of the ecosystem. And so one is talking of the one health aspect. So ultimately, the right solution, a good solution, is not going to be about one particular problem to be solved, but is ultimately going to lead to a larger one health solution, which will be on the whole ecosystem. And then that is something which one has to understand. So I think from understanding to action, one has to take into account all these different facets of values, of the choice of time, effect of what we are doing, and also the matter of addressing a pattern, problem solving for a pattern rather than for a minuscule solution. And if you do that, then we will have particular choices of action, which will make a very different result than if you do it without this. Thank you.
Thank you, Girish. Over to you, Ashish.
Thanks, Sharad. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to try and not to repeat some of what the earlier speakers have said, all of which are great points. And there'll be a little bit of overlap, but I'll try and avoid too much. I'd like to address the issue of, well, two issues. One is the issue of knowledge itself, whose knowledge and for what. And the second of the issue of scale. This is something that I keep getting asked. Everybody says, okay, you've got this nice solution here. How do you scale it up? So this whole scaling up thing has been a big sort of, what should I say? So it's been a puzzle for a long time. And I'm going to use this, I'm going to do this using the example of one of the communities with whom I've been honored to be involved over the last 25 years, the Dalit women farmers of Deccan Development Society in Telangana, which to my mind is one of the most inspiring examples of what a community can do in the most adverse situations. We know that as Dalits and as women and as small farmers, they are triple disprivileged in a patriarchal, casteist and class-based society. And till about 30 years back, we're facing all the issues that this kind of a marginalized section of society would be facing, including severe hunger, malnutrition, lack of access to education, school, health facilities, and so on. I don't have the time to go into all the details of what happened, but basically 30 years later, with a lot of community mobilization, collective actions, bringing back their own knowledge into the centers of agricultural work, joining hands on things like seeds and knowledge and so on, they have actually been able to achieve not just food security for themselves, but also what they call food sovereignty, which means complete control over everything to do with food, the seeds, the land, the water, the knowledge, etc. And completely rejecting the Green Revolution model that has otherwise been imposed on everybody around the country. Now, I think some of the interesting lessons that emerge from that in terms of translating action, knowledge into action. Number one, the rebuilding of self-confidence amongst these women, that their knowledge is central to the kind of transformations that they want. that they don't, not that they reject outside knowledge, but that their knowledge is very much at the core of this. And how does one then revalidate not modern science validating traditional science, but themselves, or traditional knowledge, but themselves being able to revalidate it in terms of the results on the ground of what they want in terms of food security, etc. Second, the mix of this knowledge with a very deeply cultural outlook, which is to say that looking at the earth, for instance, as not just a productive system, but as a spiritual element. Okay, looking at seeds as spiritual, not just seeds as something that will give me food. Celebrating all the the festivals and so on, not just as quote unquote Hindus, Hindu festivals, but multiple different religious festivals and faiths, all of which, and trying to re-examine those festivals from the point of view of their importance for agriculture, for food, for sustenance, for nutrition, for women's, and so on. And transforming, I mean, kind of trying to combine the individual need for, let's say, food in this case, but there could be many other things. The individual's need for dignity in a casteist and patriarchal society, with community action, and kind of reimagining or imagining oneself as being an individual within a collective rather than an individualistic human being. This is something that also modern development has done to us. It made all of us selfie junkies, which is to say we are our individual thing. We need to be rich and famous and powerful and so on. But we're kind of not really looking at the collective around us, which after all has so much in the making of us as individuals. But from that individual and community action, also moving to larger scale, not by saying, okay, Deccan Development Society or these Dalit women farmers will become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and become like a national organization, which is unfortunately what's happened to some of our NGOs, not to mention corporations, of course. But to say that we will work with farmers elsewhere to see what are the lessons from what we've learned, and maybe they can adapt it in their own context and be able to do similar food sovereignty, food security work, but also provide or create a platform, in this case, the Millet Network of India, which could do advocacy at the level of the nation itself in terms of policies for agriculture, or within Andhra and Telangana, to say, okay, what should the state policies be which could support this kind of action, not in a top-down way, but in a facilitative manner. So the scaling then is not a scaling up, but a scaling out, which is to say you're transferring lessons from these sorts of incredible examples to others who could then use those lessons, including the values that Girish very rightly spoke about, which are at the core of this, no? The value of collectivity, the value of interdependence, the value of sharing, the value of caring, the value of sort of a cultural and spiritual outlook towards the rest of nature and each other, and so on. So that is the kind of concept of scaling out, which I think is really important. And along with this, something that Shripad spoke about, combining this kind of alternative action with resistance. So when, for instance, GMOs are being imposed by a certain agricultural establishment, the same women are out on the streets fighting against or arguing or protesting against GMOs, or against the imposition of other kinds of agricultural programs and policies, hybrids and chemicals and so on. So I think it's this whole sort of combination which is really crucial. Do I still have 2 minutes? Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go to another example to bring out a little bit more on the knowledge issue, which is handloom weavers in Kutch. This is a community of Wankars that we've been working with over the last few years, trying to, in a participatory way, understand the kind of transformations taking place in their lives as a result of the fact that while they were in severe decline, handloom weaving in that part of India, everywhere in India, has been in severe decline, and in early 2000s they were almost finished. From 2005-06 onwards, due to many different innovations by themselves and an organization called Khamir, they were able to recreate their products based on a local organic cotton, Kala cotton, and actually create a market for that, so that in the last 15 years, handloom weaving has revived significantly, to the extent that young men who had gone off to work to the Gulf or to Adani or Tata factory have actually are coming back into handloom weaving. And it's a very interesting mix of what they're talking about. They're saying, of course, in terms of livelihoods, we have something that's viable, even though as pay, they might be getting less than what they were getting in the industry. And we're asking why? Because we are our own boss here. We can work at our own time. We can work within our own families. We're continuing the heritage while also expressing our own innovations. They're doing a lot of very innovative stuff, not necessarily sticking to the old products, but they're still sticking to the old chap, the kachi chap, as it's called, the brand. And what they're trying to do is to mix and match knowledges. So there are modern training schools also, which some of them have gone through in terms of, say, new products. They are using mobile technologies to be able to do the marketing. I'll just finish in a minute. And it's this hybrid cultures, hybrid knowledge, hybrid technologies, but within a context of cultural respect for their own traditions, for instance, and their families, which what they're trying to create. There are problems. For instance, the ecological footprint has significantly increased because the marketing is now done globally, whereas earlier a lot of the trade used to happen locally. And these are issues that need to be looked at, which is what we're trying to do with the participatory research. And that also relates, last point, to the point I think one of the earlier speakers made, that when you make transformations happen in one field, it may not necessarily reflect positively in another aspect of life. Here it's respected, it has reflected very well in terms of gender transformation of the relations between the young and the old and so on in a very positive way. But a little bit of the ecological context and some of the economic context of greater inequality is something that is of concern. So I think it's very important to look at the multiple dimensions of transformation when you transform, and how does one understand that, so that further actions in an iterative way, as Shripad mentioned, are something that you can then take to make positive even those dimensions which are not positive right now. Thanks, Shripad. Thanks, Sharad.
Thank you, Ashish. Rajeswari?
Thank you. Thank you, Sharad, and the FES community for giving me this opportunity again. We had a really good discussion the last time we met. Girish was conducting the session. I mean, there's a lot that has been said. So let me just speak about, your question specifically. What do I do? What do you do? And what should I do? What can I do? As other two questions that you had asked. But may I also add what I want to do? Yeah. So very, very quickly, as an individual, well, as a teacher, as a researcher, I mean, there are behavioral changes, yes. But I have also realized that engaging with material changes is important as an individual. So in other words, even if you let's say, even if I produce as in really produce, a few tomatoes, some palak, in your own balcony, in whatever space we have. I mean, tiny little changes that we can do as individuals, that matters. And again, I live in a campus, in a beautiful campus. So, encroach some land, grow some dhania, palak, and whoever wants can cut it and take it, right? I mean, so we kind of doing a lot of small things like that as individuals, yes. In terms of, communities, community mobilization, activities that we can do as I do with communities. Yes, I do work with a lot of civil society organizations and networks. The Revitalization Rainfield Agriculture Network that we had the last time we met is one of the big networks that I work with, but also with several other smaller organizations. And one of the things that we've been trying to, let's say, emphasize is creation of more value added at the rural level. So in terms of my, let's say, community engagement, mainly, let's say I'll put it as two-pronged. Yeah, one is with rural India, and the other is with the younger people I interact with, because I've got undergraduate students in my classes now. So I worry about how they grow and what they will do as they grow, and what kind of world we're leaving for them. So two things that one is, of course, the civil society engagement, but also show them that academia the ways in which we value academic work need not be done the way in which, well, the kind of indicators that we've been given, right? Publications, but what kind of publications? So in everything that I produce as an academic, there will be somebody from the civil society organization networks that I work with, from the field, well, groups that well, are actually extremely articulate and very, very learned. Yeah, but well, you know, you may not see them in the conventional academic journals. So I make it a point to make sure that we write with them, that we work, that we get them, well, students to read them as, well, not just as what academics classify as grey literature. Yeah, so that's one transformation that I hope I can continue doing, working. Again, it's not that knowledge is valuable, or let's say understanding happens only if it appears in an academic journal, not that at all. But the fact that the academic community needs to change from within is something that we all have to face, and there's no other option. We've become far, far too isolated just outside the campus where I live. I live in JNU campus, my husband works here. I mean, very few people engage with these questions, you know, about what is the academic life here. I mean, they always see, I mean, JNU, again, a very, 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 you know, well, social science and politically oriented kind of organization. Well, engagement with the local community, other than, of course, students and faculty buying and selling in the local region, is very minimal. So local engagement is something that I think we as academics can engage with and do. And that's something that I've been trying to do in various locations that I work with. One is, of course, the other point that I want to make is about working with policy and structural change questions, right? My life in terms of, well, let's say my academic life in terms of policy work, well, has been a failure, because we work with policymakers who we hope will address rain-fed agriculture questions. Yep, there's been, well, it's like banging your head against a wall. The idea that rain-fed agriculture involves not just rain-fed as in water or irrigation, but an understanding of the interactions between, well, soil, water, crop, again, social and ecological systems that work on these, well, rain-fed tracts, that is extremely difficult within an administration that is so siloized. Yeah, they just don't get it. So again, is it a problem because we actually were talking for a long time to the union government and not to the state governments? Maybe yes. So as we've started talking more to engaging more with state governments and with some local governments, there's been more engagement and there's been more understanding and responses. Yeah. So the RRA network, for instance, I think that Ravindra and Brahmo both spoke about it, engagement with the Andhra government, with Maharashtra, local government actions, with the Orissa Millet Mission. A lot of engagement has come with the state government. And that, I think, has been a major shift that has enabled, well, some positive insights and working with what we call positive deviance. Yeah, people who can actually make changes within the system. So enter, stretch, and transform, as in work within systems and try and transform. I mean, enable change has been a big agenda for some of us. So in terms of teaching the pedagogic content, I mean, I always insist that I teach interdisciplinary courses, but also one of the things that I made it a point in my teaching, also engagement with civil society organizations, is to ensure that there is teamwork. I mean, the kind of questions that I get in class, I mean, how will you grade us? Supposing out of this 5 people in this team, you put us in the wrong team, this guy doesn't work. Yeah, they just don't understand the entire team fails if you have one person who doesn't work. But the moment these things are clear and you tell them the criteria, you share the criteria with them, you show them what it is, as Stephen Marglin's community work shows, that the economics of community action will tell you that communities of affinity will kick in. So immediately the person who's supposed to be, well, not working well, will kick in and will work well, because to keep the community together, to keep the team working together becomes a moral responsibility for that person. Well, teamwork with young students has been one of the biggest learning experiences that I've had in the past 3 years. A lot of insights about what Girish just said about creating harmony. Yeah. with diverse people, with people from diverse backgrounds, and Shiv Nadar University, where I work, we have a really very, very interesting diversity of students, extremely diverse backgrounds, I mean, language skills, whatnot. But they get together as a team, and when you divide a class into a team of 5 people in each team, I mean, it's an amazing, explosive, well, and also very, very interesting engagement, and they do perform. So some of these principles that you want to teach them about, communities of affinity, for instance, just fall in place immediately. That, I think, is an important engagement that I've learned with. I'd also like to emphasize one little point that came up earlier about reducing consumption, what Shripad said. What I work on and work with is about reducing throughput. Of the 3 R's, reduce, recycle, reuse, I mean, we all know that reduce is the one thing that just hasn't worked, right? Recycle, at least we know that 6% of material extracted is recycled, 6%, yeah? And we extract even more every year, yeah? So in terms of both ecologically unequal trade and growth, it's very important to emphasize reduce throughput, reduce matter, energy, and also this information overdose. I mean, we don't need this kind of, wasted intelligence. We need to be very astute in the things that we engage with, yeah, material, energy, information exchanges. And that's something that I work with I mean, hopefully more work with younger people, and questions of growth that come up there. Post-growth engagement as something that again, India does not have to grow as in this GDP growth. We don't need that. I mean, that's something that, again, a book that we did, where we've tried to show that we have so many alternative. Ashish mentioned some of them. I mean, Shripad mentions, but there are, Kalpanatai mentioned some of them. There are so many ways of engaging with prosperity, local human and ecological health. Yeah. This is possible in our cities, as Amita was saying. There are so many ways of doing this. So a post-growth thinking in terms of local, well, short value chains, short value networks, prosperity, that is something that we have evidence of. We need more work on this to bring out this work together with civil society organizations, with individual social movements, and academia, and again, positive deviants amongst our bureaucracy. There are many of them. We can work towards this, bringing together and discussing some of these alternatives available in this country with our younger people. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rajeswari, and thanks to all the panelists. I think we've had a very rich set of ideas tabled by all of them. What we're going to do now is Gurudas is going to start off with a few questions for some of the panelists, and then we'll request them to respond, and then I'll table a few more, and then at some point, maybe at around 6:15 or so, we'll start. We'd already weave in some of the questions that have come in the Q&A box into our questions, but we'll sort of make it more audience focused as we go along. So Gurudas, please.
Yeah, I think the first set of nuggets were really good, and that has allowed us to put down a couple of questions which we have had in mind for that. I think I'll start with the first question addressed to Kalpanatai. Everyone here has talked about individual choices and how that influences the rate and scale of resource consumption. Shripad specifically talked about, if cropping pattern needs to be changed, it has to be met with change in food choices. One of the things, Kalpanatai, you had said in your earlier session was that lifestyle is one of the biggest influencers of water scarcity. Now, I would like to ask you if there is an example of an awakening happening upon this issue, or any experiments that you have encountered or you have done yourself in nudging lifestyle changes within villages.
Lifestyle, actually, whatever we consume, there is a virtual water behind it. And there are many changes individually as well as at the community level, that people are trying to grow their own food locally and consume locally. What I would like to say that today, whatever planning is happening at the central or the state level, and then the schemes are implemented at the taluka level. But there is such a diversity in the resources, the local condition, the local economy. the plan has to generate at the taluka level, and they need more autonomy to implement the schemes so that they will be more suitable environmentally, ecologically, and economically also. Because today, most of the raw material from agriculture is exported either to the cities or to the processing unit, and again they are coming back. So we have to shorten this cycle, that we have to create an economy based on land, water, and labor, as well as knowledge, which will be self-sustaining and surplus, and that also within certain limit. As rightly everybody said, that GDP is not the criteria for development, but unfortunately today, every year, everybody wants increase in salary. Even everybody, we are talking in terms of money, but not in terms of services, or not in terms of what kind of lifestyle we have. In agriculture also, whatever is being produced is for the market and not for self-consumption in many places. So all these things, I think, need to address while doing the planning, and that planning has to be done locally, taking into consideration the local situation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I'll continue this question to Shripad. You have been an advocate of demand management rather than supply management of water. So carrying the question which Kalpanatai just responded to over to you, we would like to know, do you have any examples where there is a community or a village who has done effective demand management, especially in water surplus areas? In rain-fed areas, of course, we know that demand management is a way of life for some villages. But in water surplus areas, would you have any examples of that?
I'm not sure how to respond to that. Actually, because when you talk about water surplus area, surplus is of course, ecologically, the term surplus is very deceptive, because
yes,
so surplus, and particularly surplus, to talk of surplus is very difficult unless we have external water being brought into the area.
That is what I meant, actually. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so I'm not really sure whether I have an example of that top of my head. But I would say that there have been attempts like that. For example, in Punjab, which, as I mentioned, is otherwise a lot of it, not all of it, but significant areas of it are arid or semi-arid, and it has been in a way transformed into surplus, because there has been massive amounts of external water that has been brought into the area, partly through the canal irrigation from the Bhakra and the Pong dams and other sort of dams. But also, a lot of the surplus water which is coming into Punjab is actually the groundwater extraction, which is being extracted beyond the recharge limit. So I think it's not often realized that the groundwater and in terms of the quantity, the groundwater extraction in Punjab is probably twice or even maybe thrice the surface water which is coming into the estate. And there we have seen, when we had done quite extensive studies in Punjab, we have seen that there has been some attempt to look at the demand management because of a crisis. I think somebody earlier talked about how crisis is something that gives rise to, possibly is the point from where solutions can spring up. And because Punjab has faced crisis, Punjab and Haryana, the agriculture system faced crisis in terms of, sort of declining marginal yields. You need to keep putting in more and more inputs to maintain the same level of yield or same level of yield increase. The ecological, the fertility response of the soil is declining. The cost of the inputs is going up. So you may be producing more, but unless there is a public support, the the cost benefit in terms of at least the monetary cost benefit is declining. So in response to this crisis, there have been attempts to shift the cropping patterns in the state from, say, rice, wheat to different things. People have talked about growing tomatoes or growing chilies and a lot of other crops. There have been also, in fact, very interesting demand management solutions proposed where the state would actually pay the farmer to not grow anything. So there has been this kind of thing happening. Unfortunately, it has not worked. And I think it has not worked partly because I think any such solution, and interestingly, some of these solutions were proposed as early as late 90s, then they have been reproposed in sort of early 2000, and now again with the whole farmers agitation, again those issues are being talked about, or at least they ought to be talked about. And I think one of the reasons, or I think the sort of main reason why this shift in cropping pattern to less water intensive crops, that is what they have been trying to do, has not worked is because it needs a combination of an ecological understanding and to get the economics right, and of course to bring the farmer on board, and it also needs state support, so to bring it all together. And for example, we saw that in Punjab, where farmers told us that when they tried to shift the crop to growing chilies from rice, they said that the soil has gotten so compacted that the chili crop doesn't grow. So it may also take a few years for the transformation to happen. And all those things don't seem to have been, worked in. But at least that is one example where I could think of, in a so-called surplus area, people have been thinking about some of these issues, but it has not worked fully, or it has not worked, I think, to any significant extent.
Yeah, thank you for that. One of the questions which kept recurring in all the last four sessions and also in the panelist discussions was the one about GDP as a measure of economic growth. So I would like to keep this question open for Ashish as well as Girish to come up with their experiences either from Vikalp Sangam or from BAIF. Have you encountered villages or communities who are measuring their development in their own manner? It may not be the manner that we are used to in terms of numbers, but either measuring the development of a village or a community or the prosperity of a village or community. Are there any examples that are coming to your mind?
Girish, you go first.
Yeah. What comes to my mind is from our tribal development program, BAIF's tribal development program, where we have been implementing what we call as an Wadi approach which actually evolved over a decade plus of work with the tribal communities. And I would also like to relate this to a line which I had read in one of Isaac Asimov's science fiction, where he has talked about happiness and sufficiency as being the end results of good development. So, we are not measuring in terms of, when you are talking of sufficiency, there is both a objective and a subjective element into that. So we are not just saying so much of production, so much of value. We are also saying this is sufficient for me. And the other thing is that when you're talking of happiness, we are not just talking of the use values that we generate out of what we produce or sell, but also how one gets satisfied with that. So it is a very interesting combination, these two terms of objective and subjective parameters. So why I want to relate to that is what I feel is that in the Wadi program, the way it has evolved and the way it has developed, it has led to the development through the effort of the tribal family of a farming system which is highly integrated, which is not just focused on production but also focused on environmental restoration. It also brings about as an outcome of an improved land and water resource as a result of that. And then there is involvement of the family for the whole year in very meaningful activities which relate to this type of integrated farming system activity. So they generate from hand-to-mouth existence, when they were migrating for 6-7 months in a year just for survival, we have turnaround cases and lakhs of them, turnaround cases who have settled down into a new type of a livelihood, which is producing enough sufficient for their own survival, the sufficient for their own consumption, but also producing for the market. So they are also getting to trade of those commodities. They are also getting something which is required for purchased items. But apart from that, they have a lot of improvement in the status of their health, the status of their nutrition, their consumption security is there, and so they have moved from abject poverty and situation of misery to a situation of what can be termed as sufficiency and happiness. And I think this goes beyond just GDP calculations. One can calculate the GDP calculation for a tribal village where we have worked this program, and one could calculate in terms of economic terms. But I think what is more important is not just the value of the farm output that has resulted from this program, but also the stability in life, the health improvements, the meaning that they have found in life. There are people who say that they don't want to migrate. Most of them, they were migrating at one time. They don't want to migrate. Even if they are getting a few thousand rupees less in their farmland, they would prefer that because it has so much more dignity and so much more meaning in their lives. So I think this is an example. We have not measured it in other terms or in measures such as happiness and all that like Bhutan has done. But what we think that this is beyond economics, and it is economics plus. And from that sense, I think this program has created something which is GDP plus.
Right. Thanks so much. I think Ashish had some examples to share.
Yeah, well, firstly, just quickly going back to the Kutch example that I shared, the young people and what they're saying in terms of the narrative of why they're coming back into handloom weaving was clearly a mix of not just the economic remuneration they're getting from this product, but also the psychological satisfaction of being able to work, be in control of their own workspace and work time, the social satisfaction of being able to be working within the family, the satisfaction of the continuing the heritage, and many other things. Okay, so that was very interesting. But I'll give you a couple of other examples from other sectors or other parts of India. So as you know, with the Forest Rights Act, at least in some parts of India, communities have been able to reclaim community rights to the forest, including full ownership over the non-timber forest produce and so on. Now, you could think of this being a situation where in a typical economic mindset, the community would then start selling off those forest produce as fast and as rapid, as wide and as many as possible. But there's a lot of discussion going on within the community itself in terms of not just the sustainability of the resource, which is a very important one, of course, but also things like, for instance, there's a village called Panchgaon where they decided not to harvest the Tendupatta for at least 5 years or probably longer. One, because they said, why should we harvest and sell something and make money which is destroying somebody's health? Because Tendupatta is used to make beedis. And secondly, they said a substantial amount of wildlife also depends on the Tendu. And we want to make sure that we are regenerating the forest well enough for the wildlife also to be able to prosper. Now that's an incredible mindset, right? I mean, where you can legally and viably be actually harvesting all the Tendupatta or other produce from that forest. Another example is I was actually just 2 weeks back in this village called Kunaria in Kutch, which did some fantastic COVID resilience. I mean, showed COVID resilience in an amazing way in terms of health, economy, livelihoods, NREGS, etc. And one of the things they've done in the last couple of years is to start measuring the changes and the transformations, measuring qualitatively and quantitatively the changes that are happening in the village using the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I personally am not very fond of the SDGs for various reasons, but it's a substantial improvement over, say, a GDP kind of a approach. And one of the things the Panchayat there told me was that, in the pandemic, what they've realized is that they need to start getting more and more and more self-reliant and self-sufficient, not just for things like food and water, but also for household items. They spend 40 lakh rupees a month, just that one village, on household items, soaps, oils, detergents, blah, 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 all that, all of which is money that corporations are making. And they're saying, why can't we, within a cluster of villages here, actually produce much of that? And in doing so, also question ourselves in terms of how much do we really need to consume out of those sorts of items, and what sorts of consumption do we need to make. So I think this is another very interesting way of looking at it, which is a much more holistic or multiple dimension way than GDP. I can give several other examples. There are still exceptions. These are exceptional examples. I don't want to give the impression that ye to pure desh mein ho raha hai. Not like that. But I think they show the potential of a very different mindset.
Thanks, Ashish. I'll probably come back to you on this question of exceptions versus, because that ties to your earlier point about scaling up. I think I want to just unpack that idea a little bit more. But I have a similar sort of slightly abstract question, but trying to push the discussion from the rural to the urban. Because I think we all recognize that the majority of the audience that is listening to an English webinar is going to be from urban areas. And maybe we should discuss a little bit more about some of the challenges that we face. I think Raji mentioned the challenge of talking to students, young students in Shiv University about how to work collectively and so on. So many such issues that we face. I wanted to raise the question of values, picking up on what Girish said about understanding includes understanding about values. And I wanted to ask this as a question, maybe perhaps starting with Amita and Rajeswari, because both are teaching, that it seems to me that some values, and there's a question also in the question box about how do we teach the value of spirituality in terms of our relationship with nature. And my sense is that among different values out there that Girish mentioned, for instance, whether it's spirituality or caring about future generations or frugality and so on, it seems that the toughest, and this is just a hypothesis, and I want Rajeswari and Amita to kind of respond and maybe even scratch it completely, that it seems that some values are tougher to teach or to inculcate than others. And I'm thinking specifically of values of social justice and democracy. And the example I have is from the conservation circles, that whenever we talk to conservationists, not all obviously, but at least some hardcore conservationists, they say that we care a lot about wildlife, we care a lot about non-human life forms, and nobody can question this as a value that is faulty in some way. But when it's much harder to point out that a one-dimensional perspective on values is insufficient, that you can't just hold one value in life and function, because we all live in an interconnected space, and whatever actions we take, including trying to save a tiger, has repercussions for somebody else. And if the repercussions were for me, I would react differently. As long as the repercussions are for some poor Adivasi in the forest, I'm responding differently. But in even pointing out this difference, I'm invoking the idea of fairness, equity, justice, and that's very difficult. People say that I don't really care about that. So I just wanted to kind of ask Rajeswari and Amita to respond to this question. Is it more difficult to teach some of these values? Or inculcate? Teach is, I think, too strong a word. Maybe inculcate, foster.
It is difficult, and it's difficult because most young people today are growing up in a culture where those values of respect for others as human beings, as other species, the ethics of care that follows from that respect, these values are present in a larger cultural ecosystem which is dominated by capitalism, which means that people prize ease, convenience, comfort. They aspire to the kinds of careers that will give them the money to be able to live good lives. And good lives for them means being able to travel abroad, eat out, have a certain kind of fancy lifestyle. Now, it's very hard under those circumstances to get young people to move beyond what might be tokenistic measures. Many of them will say, oh, I don't use straws, or I carry a water bottle instead of using Bisleri or something. These are important steps, but these don't add up to the kind of radical change that we need unless they happen to also address the larger structural conditions in which this environment is being degraded, in which poor people are being excluded. Now, how do we do that? Given that I teach at Ashoka, where the students come pretty much from privileged backgrounds, how do you get people to think about giving up power? Most of my students think that they're going to be in careers where they, because of their, prestigious degrees, their scientific training, are going to be in decision making positions. So the first thing to do is to disabuse them of this impression that their degree gives them the right to make decisions about other people. So I think the first value that I try and teach is just humility. That you should not jump to say what the solutions are until you have understood what the problem is. The problem looks very different from different perspectives, and you have to listen to and let others speak. And these others will be people who don't have your privileges. So I think getting those kinds of principles established as something to think about, because that's all we can do. We can just encourage people to think. We can't preach to them. Is some sort of a small beginning. But we also, as Rajeswari said, encourage students to get involved in other kinds of, larger social movements, in turn with organizations that are trying to make a change and so on. But I want to be absolutely clear about one thing, which is that students who are A, sensitive, and B, concerned enough to actually do something about it are few and far between. I think in this audience as well, the speakers and the audience, we are by and large a group of like minded people. But 90% of people in our society do not share our views, do not share these values. Those who are comfortable want to continue being comfortable. Those who are not comfortable, many of them actually want to, become comfortable in all the materialist ways that we think of as impossible for this planet to sustain. So I think the difficult thing here is to get people to recognize that these personal choices have to be linked up to larger political stands. And this means making yourself uncomfortable, not just through being willing to give things up in terms of your own privilege, but in terms of getting together with people who are very different from yourselves and letting them articulate their concerns and supporting them in their movements, in their collective mobilization. So that's how I come to this. But I think really the task is with this younger generation, most of them we're losing before we can even make a difference and before we can influence them. One, because so many of them are stuck in crises of different sorts. The agrarian crisis is huge. A lot of poorer younger people don't have the kinds of choices that, of the wonderful kind that Ashish described in Kutch, of being able to take up work, professions that give them skills, that give them a sense of dignity, that allow them to, make use of their community's traditions and so on. We have a crisis there. We have a crisis of all these young urban people who are doing, jobs which have no future, which are not enough to support a family. The courier delivery people, the security guards, there's a whole range of these, domestic workers. These are jobs which are dead end jobs in a way. And there's a lot of frustration there. Uh, Finally, I just want to say that I think it's really important that these concerns about people's economic anxieties, their worries about how do I make a living, be linked up with ecological questions. Right now, it just doesn't happen. Whichever political party takes up the issue of the right to food or the right to employment, they're not thinking about it in ecological terms, which is what we need to do. What if the PDS was reimagined as a system where your rations gave you not only wheat and rice, but gave you millets? What would work look like if instead of building that panchayat bhavan or repairing the road, you made sure it was used for water harvesting structures. This has been done in large numbers of areas, but we need a proper way of integrating these into a transformation of agriculture. And we need the same in urban areas. So I think the fact that no political party in India has an ecological vision is very, very telling of the way in which that environmental sustainability just isn't there in people's minds. They don't recognize the links, let alone think about how to address them. And if the young people we teach take that ecological sensibility into whatever they do, it's a small beginning, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
Thanks, Amita. Rajeswari?
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Sharad. And this question about values and it's not easy has been something that actually has been very, very disturbing. Yes, I agree. It is difficult, but for me, I was somebody who actually never thought I would teach. In fact, I used to tease my spouse saying, "You like to teach because you like your own voice." But the moment I started teaching, I realized how much you learn from your class. How much the exchange means to you. There's so much, especially in our university, in Shiv Nadar University, the student population is extremely diverse. We have students from really poor backgrounds, from extremely privileged backgrounds. There's a whole range of them. Again, like I said, language and questions of that sort also, diversity from locations. But for me, what has been interesting is to use that, to leverage that, and to show them the pluralism, well, in terms of values, where we come from, what we do, as something that is built into nature. Nature has a lot of violence. Yeah, we've heard ecologists also talk about, tigers do kill, right? What is the difference between us and nature in terms of consumption? Georges Kirogin's work, these are things that I use as value tools to show that we are the only species that has, well, let's say, an exosomatic control over energy, and consumption. That's not the way other species consume. That's not the way nature is designed. Well, consumption in nature, there's always consumption, production, and waste, and all this in nature, but it's not waste. It's always reused, right? So using the principles of nature to build value, that is using ecological principles to build some of these value questions has been a very important tool that I found handy. I haven't written this up, but I will. I promise to write that soon. But using also some of the examples that came from my class, from what students ask you, from some of the extremely disturbing questions that come in class. One of the questions that often comes to me is about freedom and the boundaries of freedom, right? So teaching them, again, this is another lesson that I learned from a mathematician colleague of mine in Shiv Nadar University, who talks about graph theory and boundaries, boundaries, connectedness. Again, what is the nature of connectivities that we should be conscious about when we consume? Small indicators that an undergraduate class, 19, 20-year-olds can use. They make a big difference to the ways in which they respond to their own teams. So like I said, teamwork that they do in class. Class exercises that are graded based on the quality of teamwork. I think that makes a big difference in terms of the values they absorb. A major concern for me has been the gender question, right? The question about gender equality and so on. There are male students who say that, there are female students who harass us. There's all kinds of questions that come back and forth. I also tell them about things of, well, it's not just, gender is not just about women and men. It's not just about so bringing in this idea that women and this question of care, for instance, caregiving happens, or let's say what women, nurturing, caring, all that happens in a patriarchal and, well, highly oppressed situation, right? Even then, right? So recognizing that there are limits to your freedom, recognizing that you live in a highly biased situation does not mean that you give up on your values. It means that you work with the values that you have, but you always make it explicit, like Mirdal says, put it on the table, Put your values on the table and say that these are what we work on. And to make that position, or make it possible for them to do that, for the class to do that, has been a big learning experience for me. Again, for a well, you know, the question of public investment, I just want to stop with that. This is because it's been a very painful experience for me with my family. I mean, many of them, you know, I find difficult to talk to. Like 90% of them don't think the way I do, right? I mean, they're all, you know, have had their qualifications and work, you know, well, in highly privileged positions now. I think all of us today participating here might have the same problems with our own families. I repeatedly engage with this question of public investment, saying that we have our degrees today, we have our positions of privilege today because of the public investment that the state made in the past. The nature of the state has changed, the nature of public investment has changed, but we have to say that, well, we have to bring in the idea of publicness and public good back to the fore. We've forgotten that. And that value, again, is something that I, again, you know, try to introduce in the class and bring back. I mean, of course, SNU is a private university, but it gives us the freedom to speak about these things and also to inculcate these values in our classrooms. That is, what is a public good? How do you distinguish that from, well, well, let's say an aggregation of private goods, yeah? So the sum of parts kind of question, but also bring to them these, like I mentioned, Stephen Marglin, I mean, some of these questions of communities as, well, community indicators and not individual indicators. What is what counts? So there are various, well, let's say, small pedagogic exercises that I've tried in class. Some of them have worked, some have backfired with some very painful questions. For instance, democracy, you know, I keep saying that it's not just a question of franchise. It's also voice and authenticity, yeah? And suddenly somebody comes up and says, you know, well, there is no authenticity in this class because I asked for a change in the assignment and you didn't listen. So, you know, it's true, I didn't, but you know, it's not a failure of democracy, but I keep saying, well, that's a challenge to democracy. We'll find a way of addressing that. Yeah, but there are ways in which we can inculcate these values, and I think we have to make it a conscious attempt because this next generation is going to face a lot of problems that we can't even imagine today, and we have to prepare them for that. That's the least that we can do. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Rajeswari. My next question is sort of drawing upon a couple of questions that were posted in the Q&A box, which was about where the word scalability popped up at me quite a bit. So that we need solutions that are scalable. And I was struck with the contrast between that statement, it was more of a statement than a question, and Ashish's point about, you know, there's a lot too much demand about this idea of scalability. The solutions have to be scalable, and really it should not be scaling up, but scaling sideways. And I just was wondering if we could unpack that a little bit more, because I was trying to link that to Ashish's last statement that yes, some of these examples that he gave are exceptions, they are certainly not the norm. And so maybe the people who are demanding the or imposing the criterion of scalability are saying that you know, maybe we have success stories in these very special circumstances. Now, there could be two reasons to talk about scalability, it seems to me. One is that the people who are talking about it come from a position of privilege, a privilege which means they have a reach across a much larger area. And I see that a lot in donors, for example. So donors want scalability. They don't just want, you know, these cute pilots, because they, you know, their kind of, what shall we say, self-worth seems to be defined by statements like we have influenced 1,000 villages or 1 lakh farmers or, you know, 10,000 slum dwellers. So it seems like they have defined their mission as, you know, at that scale, and that I think is rooted in the inequality, that the donors are sitting in a certain position of power over a certain pile of money, and then they can demand that, you know, they see impact on that kind of scale. So maybe that's not a good argument for scalability. But the other argument, which is that if we pick examples which are successful in a very specific set of circumstances, scalability is saying that can we think of ways in which you would actually have success even when those special circumstances are always not present, and at a slightly lower the threshold a little bit, people are not so you know, hung up about, let us say, self-sufficiency, or so committed to equality or whatever. I mean, and the linked point is that maybe the scalability question also has to do with the higher levels of power that we have ourselves created, right? We, in a sense, in a democratic society, we have created structures at the district level, state level, central level. And those structures cannot function at a village level or at a urban ward level. They can only function at scale. If when we ask for change, policy change, they can only function at scale. You can't ask a state government to pass a law which applies to only one village, or which will work only in very, very special circumstances that apply maybe only 10 villages. So I think that's my sort of question, maybe starting with Ashish, but others could also jump in. Maybe Kalpana, that this issue of scalability, is that a completely false demand, or is there a way to think about it more innovatively?
Thanks, Sharad. No, I don't think it's a false demand at all. I mean, certainly we want to see the kinds of solutions that are leading to more justice and sustainability and so on across the whole country, across the whole world. So if you're thinking of scalability in that sense, then yes, it's a absolutely valid worry and question. My point was that the usual approach to scalability has been scale up, which is to say that you have a Ralegan Siddhi for whatever its faults. I'm talking about some of the successful parts of it. And then you say, okay, let's do an Adarsh Gaon Yojana all across Maharashtra, and all villages within the next 5 years should become like that, with watershed and blah, 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 all that. The problem with which is many, but one of them is that there is no process built into it. At least all the examples I know of where transformation has been successful or relatively successful are where they were not projects. They were processes. They took 10, 15, 20 years. Some of them are still struggling to get things right? And that simply is not possible in a scale-up approach where you have a short-term vision of 5-year government or an NGO or a donor agency that wants to have results in the next 3 years or 5 years, maximum 5 years. So that's one big issue, a problem with the scaling up thing. Now, what I think needs to be, and where you can maybe try some shortcuts, because like maybe we're saying, okay, the whole world does not have 20 years. Okay, if in 12 years we're going to have climate collapse or whatever, I don't know, forget that. But supposing we say, okay, we want to do things faster. To me, here are a few things that would be very important to do that. One, policy shifts. Now, policy shifts does not mean the Adarsh Gaon Yojana kind of stuff, but it means that, for instance, you create the enabling possibilities for farmers who want to switch from chemical to organic and have a 3-year or a 5-year period in which the production might drop, etc., or may not have access to organic manure or other inputs, that you create the policy framework in which that facilitation happens without it being top down, without it being saying that this will happen only if you grow these crops or only if you have XYZ. One of the examples I can give you is from conservation. Now, for a long time, we argued, Sharad, you know this, Amita, many of you know about this, that community-led conservation is what the approach should be, not these top-down forest department-led kind of thing. So we pushed, and the central government did come out with a changes in the Wildlife Act, in which community reserves became one of the options. Unfortunately, community reserves was defined in such a straitjacketed way that no self-respecting community would go into that. And in fact, therefore, after 15 years of that legal change, I think there are very few community reserves in the country, except a few that the forest department has created. So on the other hand, if you had the policy shift which said any community wanting to protect its forests or wildlife or wetland or whatever will get a certain amount of financial or other kinds of support, and it's up to the community to decide how it wants to do it, what kind of institutional structure, etc. But here's the support that's available if you want to do it. I would have thought that by now there would have been 1,000 community reserves, or maybe many, many more, right? There are people wanting actually to do this and wanting that support. So that's one thing. The other is facilitating much more of the exchanges amongst people to learn from each other. So I'm not talking about an agricultural scientist going and talking about, say, what the DDS has done and going to another village and saying that. Not even somebody like me, okay? I'm saying enable the Deccan Development Society women to travel to another 20 or 50 villages, or people from there to travel to where the DDS in the 75 villages they worked. I'm just giving that as one example. There are many others. To learn from each other, to transfer knowledge, to share that knowledge with each other, to actually realize that, oh my God, I really actually already had this, or my grandmother actually knows this, but I'd not even asked her. And then to go back to my village and try it. So enabling that kind of facilitation, which some civil society groups are doing, some sensitive government officers are doing, but it's not built into the system in any way. Third, is to disable the perverse and disabling policies. I mean, 80,000 crores of rupees chemical fertilizer subsidy is the best way. You can never be able to do scalability of organic. Okay. So, and this is just one. I mean, every single field of work in which successful things can happen are disabled, there's hurdles, there are policy hurdles, legal hurdles, administrative hurdles, political hurdles along the way. Disabling that would be another huge way in which you can maybe shorten the time for this kind of scalability to take place. And I recognize completely the issue that Amita and Rajeswari has mentioned, which is that there are huge mindset issues, aspirations, etc., etc. All of this, of course, are also huge. But leaving that aside for the moment, I think these are some of the issues, some of the ways in which the scale question can be addressed.
Thanks, Ashish. I think Amita wanted to chip in also with some thoughts on the issue of scalability. Amita?
The issue of scalability is a little bit of a red herring, because I think the kind of examples that Ashish gave show us that people work simultaneously at different levels, at the level of their field, but also at the level of larger policy. And it is this kind of multiplicity that different groups of people have different skills that they can bring to bear, that gives us this network of vibrant organizations on the ground, but that are also backed up with policy advocacy organizations that are backed up with, at one level also, academic communities that support that work and help publicize it and so on. So it's not about going from small to big, but I think everyone in their own ways is simultaneously engaging with these multiple levels. And it's important to recognize that what's happening with say DDS is helped along when a state government encourages natural farming. I mean, there are complicated issues there, but this is only it's not a bad thing for there to be a concerted state effort to put money, to put people in a direction that's a departure from the kind of capital-intensive industrial agriculture that the state has so far supported. So I think what we need is all kinds of different work. It's not just about Sangharsh Nirman and that kind of slightly false binary, like Shripad said, but also about the fact that people are actually engaging in all kinds of skills, and nobody is creating an island in terms of the perfect village or the perfect project. People, I think, recognize now that their work speaks to others, both horizontally as well as in terms of vertical skills.
Thanks, Amita. I think Girish also had a point.
Yeah. Yes, I think the matter of scalability is indeed a very pertinent matter. One can appreciate the view of maybe those who want to bring about change, to see that good things are scaled up and they solve the problem, which is itself so immense. But also it is very important, the points which Ashish mentioned, and the distinction he made between scaling out and scaling up, and also what process scaling up of the process probably has a different implication. Of course, there have been very bad examples where processes have been replicated to scale up in a very, very straitjacketed manner. PRA is one example. But apart from that, I think that is a very important point. I would like to bring about a different aspect relating to scaling up, because we have grappled with this problem ever since we started having good results with the Wadi program, and there was so much possibility and need to take this program in so many other tribal families and so many other regions. So we started with 40 families. Today, our own program implementation touches some 250,000 families, but it has also been, the program has been taken up by other agencies, supported by NABARD, and it has reached to more than 600,000 families. So the question is, what do you scale up? It's not a number game. When we started grappling with this problem, we realized that what is it you want to scale up? Do you want to scale up a blueprint of a program, or do you want to scale up principles of an approach? And I think there is a very, very great difference between the principles in the approach that we had in this program design was that basically livelihoods will be created with the efforts of the families themselves. That is number one. Number two is they will work on their farming system and they will introduce perennials into the farm. So we are not talking of the farm producing only something for a season. We are talking about the farm producing throughout the year, which also means you add trees into it and you add other aspects of making the farming system productive. Then we also meant the other principle was that uh, they will produce for consumption and they will produce something for the market. So it's a combination. So basically, if we look at and of course, there's all elements of the participatory approach that we had in the designing of the program. So what we wanted, what we decided upon to be scaled up is the approach. What we decided to be scaled up is the principles behind the approach. So we will see that wherever, whichever area, whichever agro ecosystem we implement this, there would be these principles will be kept sacrosanct and they will be the cornerstones of a program. But the actual program will be designed according to the specificity in that local area, according to the contextual relevance in the local area. So the programs that we have in different areas are very different, but the principles are the same. It is a combination of perennials with seasonals. It is a combination by which it is the families who decide how they will be putting in the efforts to create a productive system which will produce for the whole year, and they are producing for their consumption first, but also producing simultaneously for the markets. So with these type of basic principles, which are replicated and they are scaled up, we have a program which takes on different hues and colors in different locations. And so we don't know what is scaled up. Numbers, yes, numbers have been scaled up, but the program content is very different because it has been done differently, though the basic principles are the same. The same thing has happened with some of the implementation of watershed programs. If you want to really have a good watershed program, you have to have the communities involved in the planning at that village level. And then the basic principles are something which are replicated, which are upscaled. Basic principles of soil conservation, water conservation are upscaled, but not necessarily the exact design of the program. So what to scale up becomes a very crucial matter.
Thanks, Girish. What I'm going to do now, in interest of time, is pick up three questions that have come in the Q&A box and sort of toss them to who I think might be able to answer them. Although I'm not absolutely sure, I'm tossing them in. All of you could answer them, perhaps. But there's one question which seems very appropriate for Kalpanatai to answer, which is how do we make people understand that well water or borewell water is owned by the community and not only by individual landowners or landlords. So that's why I'm just going to table all three questions. So this was a question that I would request Kalpanatai to at least start answering, and then maybe Shripad could also chip in. There's a question about also related to values in a different way. What is your opinion about changing our food choices to plant-based food as one of the significant ways to reduce our impact on the environment? And the third question is more practical about, is it a good idea to have green collar jobs under the government for scaling out processes? So maybe we could start with the first one. How do you make people understand that well water is a common property resource?
Actually, the very first scheme which was started in Naigaon was Chalu Bandha Yojana, because there were two groups, one individual and the other was a community group. And there was a conflict that who has right over the water, which is there because of the percolation tank upstream. And actually that issue went up to the court also, because the people who were using the water for sugarcane, they went to the court and they said that we are growing sugarcane and this water is ours. This new scheme will affect our crop. But fortunately, the judge came to Naigaon and he gave the judgment that whatever water resources are created through public funds, the water belongs to the community. And so the scheme was completed. Another is the example of Ponde village, wherein the people came together and they said that because they had no water before. But when the conservation and the lift irrigation schemes were planned for the community, they said that we will share it equally, and whosoever are not covered in the community lift irrigation scheme, they will have the right over the water. They can have only 3.5 HP connection to their well. So this is how, when actually this is through the dialogue and through communication on the site itself. There are a couple of wells and one farmer goes deeper than the other one, but still the water is the same. And when they realize it, I think they understand that the water is common source and not individual.
Thank you. Shripad, would you like to add, or can we go to the next question?
Maybe we can just go to the next question, I think, because Kalpanatai has really covered, critical dimensions. So in interest of time.
Okay. So the next question was about the changing our food choices to plant-based food as one of the significant ways to reduce our impact on the environment. Anybody?
So maybe I can just take a shot at it. Not that I have any, sort of extra deep understanding about it, but I do have an opinion about it. So I think food choices should not be forced choices. I think that is one very important thing. I mean, for that matter, most of the choices I think should not be forced. So, but particularly food choices are something which is very, very personal. So I think it's very difficult to, say this. And it's also very cultural. It's also very personal. So that is one thing I would say. But I mean, there can be a process of awareness, education, through which people may want to shift to a lesser, food choices which have lesser footprints. So I think that is my opinion on that.
Can I have a go at that, Sharad? Yep. Okay. So I kind of worry about well, let's say just plant-based foods. Again, it depends on how and where this plant-based food is produced. There is nothing that proves that just because there is animal food, it is, well, unsustainable. Yeah. In fact, there are different kinds of meat-based, plant and meat-based, plant meat, fish-based, small ruminants-based, and there's a whole range of diverse food systems that are extremely sustainable and also extremely resilient. Yeah, because they operate in nested circles as nature has designed them to be, because people don't overconsume, because, as I quoted about Georges Kirojan's food, that is, you don't, well, you're not well storing food as, well, exosomatic energy that you capture and store and then process 50 years from now, like a McDonald's burger, right? That is a different food. Now that meat is worrisome. Yeah. Now this, well, if it's meat or what, as a species, of course, we were designed to eat meat, right? We know from the way our teeth are that is, we were designed to tear meat with our ancestors, to chew meat with our molars, when we were designed to eat meat. Fine. We can be vegetarian, fine. Like Shripad said, that's a choice. But to bring this ecological angle to legitimize plant-based food and delegitimize well, meat and fish and eggs and all these kinds of other diverse foods is wrong. One, ecologically wrong. And two, just because we have a distorted food system, not because the food system is bad, but because our economics has demanded that, well, you need structural transformation. You need to move people and their energies to work in urban areas, and you need to supply food for them. And therefore, store massive amounts of food, spend tons of energy just to well, process this food. Yeah. As food processing industry grows, people also grow more unhealthy, right? We know that. I mean, well, our generation probably will not survive as long as our parents did. Now, the point is that let's not confuse these things. I mean, there are different categories of food. Yeah. US agriculture consumes more energy than all of France does. One little sector that accounts for, well, that again employs less than 2% of its population, right? We're talking about a sector that is extremely industrialized. That kind of, well, meat consumption is bad because of its ecological footprint, because of its extremely unhealthy inputs into our bodies. but not the lead meat that you find well in our ecosystems. So let's not confuse these. And again, food choices as staples, as the staples that we had in this country, all over Asia, for instance. How did we shift to, well, rice and meat? Yeah. There are lots of important questions that we need to ask here. It's not just a question of plant-based food that's going to answer our environmental and food crisis.
Thanks. Amita?
The question of plant versus animal-based diets in India is actually something that brings together three things. Ecology, ethics in the sense of causing pain to other species, and third, religion. And several of you have raised this issue of spirituality and respect for other forms of life and so on. I think it's absolutely important to think about these questions very carefully, because the value that is placed on vegetarianism as a high caste ideal, as a Brahminical ideal, is something that is now being conflated and is, deriving legitimacy from the idea of it being ecologically more sustainable, as well as that, we're respecting animals, most particularly the cow. These are, as both Shripad and Rajeswari said, false dichotomies. What you have to look at is the way in which plant foods are being produced, the way in which animal foods are being produced. And if both of these forms of food are being produced through industrial means that are ecologically unsustainable, that use up fossil fuels, we have a problem. If you're eating Maggi, which is vegetarian, but made from wheat that's probably been grown using capital intensive means, it's not a good thing for you. It's not a good thing for the earth. If you're eating, for instance, goat meat or chicken that has been, that is free range, that, an Adivasi or a small farmer is eating their own produce, which includes meat or fish that they've caught in their fields or crabs, ecologically, that is fine. Ethically also, I think it is fine, because you have not created horrible conditions for that animal to live in. You have not abused the soil in order to grow that particular crop. So I think the ecological and the ethical question must be looked at very carefully before we fall into this easy slippage about connections between spirituality and ethics and ecology. And this is a really huge political question in our country right now. And the way in which vegetarianism is presented as a virtue is, I think, problematic, because we need to be aware of cultures where people consume meat and fish and all kinds of other things and have done so sustainably. And they have a right to do that.
I'm going to go to the last question that I had flagged, which was about green jobs and the idea of maybe public support for green jobs or creating green collar jobs through state support, if that's how I understood the question correctly. If anybody has thoughts on that, should that be a major sort of policy focus?
Sharad, can I?
Yeah, please, Ashish.
Okay, so I think, there was a very interesting report a few years back from the United Nations Environment Program on green jobs, the potential of green jobs to, or rather the potential of turning to more sustainable economies to create green jobs which have a much larger employment possibility than the, the non-green or the dirty jobs that people are being forced into right now. So one can look at that, but I think there's several issues here. Maybe I'll just raise one or two of them. I think the word green job or the green collar has been used very often in a very limited context. For instance, to say that, okay, if somebody is working in renewable energy, that's a green job, whereas if somebody is working in a coal mine or a coal thermal power station, then it's not. But I think one has to go well beyond that to be actually looking at various issues of is the work dignified? Is the work relatively, is it well paying? If payment is one of the issues. Is it work which is creative? Is it work in which the worker also has control over the means of production? There's so many aspects involved here that the word just green collar doesn't actually come to mind. One has to start looking at dignified, creative jobs. The meaning of work itself, as one of, I think, you raised or somebody else raised, and to move away from what I've been calling deadlyhoods back to livelihoods, which are where we're in an occupation which is enjoyable, which is creative, where we don't wait desperately for the weekend to enjoy ourselves because the work itself is enjoyable. These are all artificial creations, right? I mean, Sunday, you're making us work on a Sunday. Some people will complain. I'm happy. I have no problem. So, but I think there's so much involved here with the issue of what should be the transformation of work. And this is really right now very important, because one is talking about climate, just transitions in the climate crisis. The just transitions have to involve all of this. It's not simply about saying, okay, right now you're in coal-based thing, shift to renewable energy kind of thing. It's much more about the kind of social justice issues involved and the creativity and so on, which is why I gave that example of the handloom weavers. Now, it's an exceptional example, but it's an example which shows that actually there's a range of occupations, both in the traditional and in the modern sector, which are possibilities for moving towards much more dignified and, of course, also much more ecologically sustainable things. And if governments can support that, well and good. But I haven't seen too much of that almost anywhere in the world, including what Biden is doing right now, for instance. I don't see much of that. There are lots of great what should I say, proposals. One can look at, for instance, the 1 million jobs proposal from the workers' unions in South Africa, or the some of the Green New Deal kind of stuff, though that has its limitations. Or there's a fantastic feminist recovery package from Hawaii, which looks at what could be the sorts of occupations which would be much more dignified and sustainable. So there's brilliant examples of proposals, but I don't see too many governments actually going into that, because most of them want to just go back to businesses now as usual.
Thanks, Ashish. I think we are over time, so I'm going to close my part of the thing, but I think I'd like to hand it over to Gurudas. He might have a last question for you, and then he will do the closing.
Yeah, thanks so much. And it was wonderful listening to all of you. I think the one question which comes to my mind is something which perhaps is also relevant to a lot of our audience and participants here, is the question on sustainable behavior within urban society, or in any society for that matter, not just in urban society. And the obvious thing is the path from awareness of a problem to behavior which would make that problem disappear is obviously not an expressway. And that path is riddled with a lot of issues. Any change in behavior is constrained by the barriers to change, and it's also influenced by the benefits of the change. Public at large might find it very difficult to overcome the barriers to change, and they could also be oblivious to the benefits of the change. And some of the benefits of the change might accrue in future generations, especially in the situation where we are talking about climate change, behavior which will make climate change a little less painful. Those benefits will accrue. In such a situation, what could be the way ahead for policymakers? My experience has been that administration, governance, and policymakers have either been blind to the barriers to change, or they have not understood that situation very well, which means there are prerequisites to a behavioral change which takes place. So this question is open for all of you, either in the urban context or in the rural context. Do you see a sort of an approach which the administration or even individuals could take, where the path to environmentally sustainable behavior could be facilitated or enabled? Yes, Amita.
May I say something?
Yeah, sure.
I look back to my childhood and I think of the ways in which we were frugal, far more frugal than we are today. And that's to do with the fact that many of the resources we use were rationed, be it water, be it electricity. There's a way in which we have a culture of frugality which is created willy-nilly when the conditions exist. I mean, even for most poor people today, they're frugal because they can't survive otherwise. How do we bring that back? I think again, I'm going back to the existence of crises. If there's a war, people accept rationing. So, how do we think of the environmental question as an emergency, which needs concerted action, where people are willing to voluntarily give things up or agree to state imposed restrictions? So, to my mind, things are possible if we recognize that these are extraordinary times, that sacrifices have to be made today because of, Gurudas, as you said, the future. If we care about our children, our grandchildren, whatever, what are people willing to give up?
Yeah, Ashish, you wanted to have a clue?
Hey, just a quick one. I wrote some time back about the need for a sustainable consumption line, which is like nobody should be below the so-called poverty line. Nobody should be above sustainable consumption line, which is not something that should be imposed from above by the government, by diktat or whatever. But it's something that needs to, like Amita said, needs to be worked out as a social compact, so to speak, which is a social contract, in the sense of like switching from, what was that Onida ad? Owners pride, neighbors envy. Completely switching that around. Non-owners pride and neighbors envy. So I've lived without a fridge for the last 15 years. I don't know if my neighbors envy me or wonder what the hell I'm doing without a fridge. But that's cultural shift can happen. There's no reason to. If you look at cycling in Europe, it's a great example of that. I mean, you can see so many cities in Europe where businessmen in three-piece suits, politicians, are actually cycling home to work. Now, if that can happen in a highly materialized and industrialized society like that, there's no reason why those cultural shifts can't happen here. But there's a second and very crucial point here, I think, which is the empowerment of communities who are suffering the consequences of our overconsumption. If Pune's garbage is going into Devachi Urli, the empowerment of Devachi Urli to say, no, we will not accept your garbage. You do with it what you want. And the more we force that kind of, what should I say, the realization and the stoppage of these long distance invisible externalities that all of us who have our consumption levels are enjoying, the more that we will actually wake up and say, oh my God, if I can't throw my garbage out because nobody's going to deal with it, I need to produce less garbage. And by I don't mean me individually. I mean, of course, has to also happen at a community and a collective level. So I think these two things would also be very important in terms of behavior changes.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Anybody else wish? Yes, Rajeswari. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a very brief point about the ability to recognize this behavioral change that's needed, and also our ability as citizens to affect that is to recognize the barriers. One of the things that I think we often understate is the politics of this unsustainable situation now. And I think once that becomes explicit to people about a few that are gaining from the current situation, there are some people who are continuing to gain from the situation, at least for the time being. Yeah, that we are all losers in the end game is something that we have to make clear to everybody, and that's one of the biggest barriers, and that's very difficult to communicate. But also, policymakers themselves who can make different policy choices. For instance, food security, right? Why should the goal be production of food availability or access? Why can't it be, as V.K.R.V. Rao's goal was, minimizing nutritional inequality? Now, if that is the let's say the policy goal, the instruments you choose would not be fertilizer subsidy. The instrument you choose would not be, let's say, even a public distribution system, but it would be a local value network, which would actually add value to local ecological and, production consumption systems, whether it's farm households or agricultural labor. So drafting an alternative set of policy goals itself would actually reveal, well, it would be an eye-opener to many of our policymakers. We don't seem to be doing that either.
Yeah, Shripad?
Yeah, just two quick points. I think any behavioral change, I think, is best managed if the people concerned see the benefits of that. So I think that is very important. And of course, I understand that some of the benefits of the kind of behavioral change we're talking about maybe in the longer term, but I think there are also benefits which are immediate and then in the medium term. And I think it's very important to bring those out. So I think that is very important. Whether it's a shift to organic food or shift to millets or cycling, or these are the very everyday examples that we are talking about. For example, a shift to millets, I think the benefits could be immediate, and if they are understood, I think it would really help the benefit, the behavioral change. At the same time, I think we must understand that individual actions and individual choices are limited by the enabling environment. Again, a point which has been made earlier. And enabling a change in the enabling environment. For example, if I want to cycle, it needs to be safe for me to cycle, or if I'm cycling in a polluted road, then I'm really going to harm myself, and I'm not going to make that change. So the change in the enabling environment has to come from a larger systemic change, which means policy. And I think that can happen only when the values which are driving the policy change. So, and I think that point was made, I think, values by Girish way at the beginning of this thing. So I think that's really at the core. What are the values that our policies are trying to push? And I think that again is a very important point when we talk about behavioral change. And the last point I want to make is that the point I made is that a behavioral change should not be driven by force. So for example, Amita mentioned frugality. If frugality is to be driven by rationing, that is, the scarcity of certain things, it may not be long lasting. I think real frugality is value driven. A long lasting frugality is value driven. I will use less water even if there is abundance of water around me. I will use less electricity even if I have access to unlimited electricity, and so on and so forth. So I think that would be the long-lasting behavioral change, which is driven by values. I think that is what I would like to emphasize. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So, Girish, you had a point to make?
Small comment.
Yeah, okay.
When lot of studies were done on behavioral changes, and the famous of them are the Hawthorne experiments, and they very clearly brought out that behavior affects attitude. Change in behavior affects attitude. Similarly, a change in attitude also affects behavior. So I don't think we have one answer to that problem. We need to tackle both attitudinal changes through awareness and sensitization, which will affect behavior. We may also need to change behavior first with either enabling methods or some punitive methods in order to bring about a transition. But as Shripad said, the long-lasting thing will only be something which comes from within. So it has to be finally driven towards that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Sharad, do you have any concluding remarks, or do we close for the day? I think we have had a brilliant discussion today, and as well as in the last 5 sessions. I take this opportunity to thank each one of the panelists today, as well as in the last 4 sessions, and our anchors. As we come to a close of this Prakash Gole Memorial Webinar, my colleagues at Ecological Society and ATREE, we are sure our audience has been able to take back at least something, if not a lot, as I have been able to. Especially in this last session, I've had several terms which I think are very useful and relevant to a better future. Culture of frugality, values deciding actions, siloed administration versus intersectoral policy, elite escapes, how can we avoid them, sustainable consumption line, which Ashish talked about. Several of these new concepts, as well as terms which have come up, are certainly going to be useful for a better future. However, the holy grail of sustainable development rests squarely upon individuals as much as it does upon government and administration. And here is what I recall, a brilliant essay which was written, I think, way back in 1960s by Alfred Kahn, the American economist. It was titled The Tyranny of Small Decisions. And there was a follow-up article which was written by the ecologist William Odom, which was titled Environmental Degradation and the Tyranny of Small Decisions, which essentially talks about individual small decisions which are probably spaced out in time and scale, but together they might be rational individually, but together they constitute a huge undesirable outcome or suboptimal outcome. And this is how our policy is derived today, is based on how people think and how people are behaving. So I want to leave you with this thought in mind that individual actions, however small, are contributing to the tyranny of small decisions. So it starts at home, charity begins at home. And as Rajeswari said, we would need to take up the fight with the local administration first, rather than at Delhi. And Delhi is a huge fight, as we are seeing these days on television. It's not an easy fight to win. So the local administration is something that is a little more malleable than the people there in Delhi. With that, I would like to thank each and every one of you again. It would be really unfair to pick up a few names, and yet I would want to thank Sharad personally, Ajay, Santosh, Shatakshi, all of these people, and of course the entire team of Friends of Ecological Society, and especially Kisan, who has been completely instrumental on allowing us to do these 5 webinars on their platform without a single technical glitch for 5 into at least 2 hours, which is, that's about more than 10 hours. I'm really, really thankful to Kisan for having that. We really have a good friend in them. With that, I would like to finish this, my chat, and invite Sharad if he has a few words of gratitude for our panelists.
Well, certainly, I would just like to join you in thanking our panelists. As you said, all of them, as well as all the others who participated in the earlier webinars, have provided us with this enormous food for thought. And it's just, maybe we have just scratched the surface, but with the Ecological Society's long-term commitment to building such dialogue, building awareness, building thoughtfulness, in a sense, in society. Prakash Gole's commitment to doing that through the diploma course, but even otherwise, and the other activities of the society. I think all of us are really wanting to continue this effort, and let's see how we can take this forward. The next year's Prakash Gole Memorial Series, we might try something else, but we will not forget what we have learned, although perhaps it's a challenge for us to absorb and translate everything into our minds and actions. But it's been really wonderful. I again want to thank all of you, and it's been a great collaboration between Ecological Society and ATREE. So I want to thank Ecological Society for inviting us to be a partner in this, and of course the audience. I think we've had a wonderful audience all throughout, and thank you to them. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Good night. Thank you.